Welcome to Small Church Big Table. One of the things a lot of Christians are talking about today is what does it mean to be transgender and what's the role of transgender people in the church? So I thought I would take a look at some of the passages in the Bible that for me have made me curious and helped me think in some ways that I haven't thought before. So I want to start with thinking about what does it mean to be transgender. The scripture is really helpful because it starts off at the very beginning. When it talks about the creation of humanity, it talks about how God created Adam, which is actually a gender neutral being, and then Adam becomes male and female. So the original creation was ungendered, you could say. And male and female are said to reflect the image of God, which is super interesting because one of the things that means is, well, God is not binary. God's Trinitarian. It's this relational cohort of three. So what does it mean to reflect God? Apparently, you don't have to have just two, because that wouldn't be an accurate reflection of the three. So all the way here at the beginning in Genesis, it raises some theological questions about, hey, is it okay not to fit the male-female binary? Also, it might be worth pointing out that it says that God created male and female, as opposed to saying God created male or female. It's not an either or, they're both there, and they were both in that original Adam. So as we wrestle with this, we see that picture of either or in Genesis, where it talks about there was morning, there was evening, there was light, there was darkness. But we know certainly there was dusk and dawn, right? Where it's not fully light and it's not fully dark. And there's land and sea, but certainly there were estuaries and marshes and tide pools. And there are amphibians, not just animals and fish. God's creation has a lot of diversity to it. And Genesis 1 is primarily a poem talking about the glory of God and the glory of creation, not a science textbook, really. So as we think about what it means to be trans, I'm no expert. I'm just trying to learn. But what we see in Genesis, one way or the other, is not necessarily the ideal, okay? So think about this. In the book of Revelation, a couple of different times, it talks about how there were people from every tribe and people and tongue and nation gathered around worshiping Christ. Well, that's our ultimate history. That's where we go. That's destiny. That's the best of the best. And yet notice it includes these categories that are not in Genesis. Ethnic diversity and language diversity, cultural diversity, all these things. We don't see those in Genesis, but we do see them in the end. So it makes you wonder if other kinds of diversity, for example, gender diversity, might be part of God's ultimate plan. And you see sort of a trajectory towards this in the scripture. So in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 23, it specifically says that those who were considered eunuchs were not allowed in the temple. Now, eunuchs were those who had been castrated or didn't necessarily fit the male-female binary. Pliny the Younger talked about them. Pliny the Younger is a Roman historian writing in the 1st century, and he talks about them as a third gender. Okay. So all the way here in Deuteronomy, those who were sexual minorities, who were, you could call them the trans people of the day, were not allowed in the temple. But by the time you get to Isaiah 56, much further in the Old Testament, you have this promise that eunuchs not only would have a place in the temple, but it would be a place of pride. It's talking about faithful eunuchs, those who honor God with their worship. It's the same place where it talks about how how my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. Again, it's this eschatological view towards the end, the ultimate reality, and that all nations will be there. And, well, eunuchs are going to be there too. You see this in the New Testament, where there's the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, fully included in the church of God. Jesus himself affirms gender minorities in Matthew chapter 19, where he quotes back to Genesis 2 about male and female and uses that as an image of marriage. And then he describes the eunuchs right afterwards in verse 12, talking about the sexual minorities, and he describes them as those who were born this way, made this way, or who chose this way. He gives kind of a spectrum of those who are not fitting the male-female binary. Jesus is, and he uses them not as the butt of a joke, but rather he lifts them up as a model of discipleship. That's how Jesus treats folks who didn't fit the gender norms of the day. So I wonder if there's an invitation from Scripture for us to think about being transgender as fully honored in God's kingdom.